coming up.
We'll stay on the bank losses for a moment. I think, so 22-23, the loss is $3.1 billion. Is that correct?
Policy tools that would punish investments in capital, I would assume, would then have the opposite effect, that it would lower productivity.
You want to have an environment, all policies in that encourage investment in capital. Absolutely.
Do you think it's still time to break the glass?
Does the senior deputy governor agree struggling families cannot afford higher taxes and more inflationary spending that drives up the cost of everything and keeps interest rates so high?
Can you compare our decline in GDP per capita with our peer countries, thinking mainly about the United States, where we've seen them increase in per capita GDP growth compared to Canada? Could you comment on that?
The losses that you're incurring now, where previously you'd always been a net contributor, you have turned into a net debtor now. Could we get a copy of you had mentioned it at a previous question and then referenced it, could we get the time you expect to go from deficit into surplus, and then even beyond that, if you see a net to come out ahead, we would appreciate that. Is that something we can get? Increase that
Point of order,
investors
Chair.
are worried. Yes, Mr. Desjardins.
I believe that your latitude as our chair in this regard has stepped into overreach. And I believe that the questions that you're now pursuing are largely in favor of the Conservative Party.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
From the Bank of Canada, Carolyn Rogers, Senior Deputy Governor. Thank you for coming in today.
One of my first times at Public Accounts in a while, but it's nice to see you again. I just want to we'll stay on the bank losses for a moment. I think, so 22-23, the loss is $3.1 billion. Is that correct?
So there's a little bit of a transposition. Our year end and Department of Finance's year end don't match up, but if you're looking at the public accounts number, that's the correct number. Yeah.
And the year prior? I don't have the number in front of me, but was there a loss recorded in the year prior?
Accounts? I'll maybe turn to my colleagues.
21, 22?
I have 22, 23 numbers with me.
You don't have them? Okay.
I don't think so.
That's okay. But it's... Oh, sorry.
We had a surplus in the public accounts of $2.3 billion.
Right, so we went from a surplus in 21-22 to a loss in 22-23, and the expectation is for a loss again in this next year, correct? Okay. And my understanding is that the loss is actually very sensitive to the prevailing interest rates. That is, if the interest rate goes down, the losses will shrink. Is that correct? Okay. But if the interest rate stays where it is or goes up, the losses will grow, correct?
Correct. As you said,
Okay.
It's sensitive to interest rates. Yeah.
So, and the projection, the government's projections are that interest rates will actually go down. So the government is projecting its fiscal track or its fiscal health that interest rates will actually fall. But if interest rates just stay the same, that means the loss will actually be bigger than what the government projects. Is that correct?
I'm not able to speak for the government's projection. I'll maybe ask my colleagues to do that.
We have a limited ability to forecast Crown Corporation income into the future, but what you've described as the general relationship between interest rates holds.
Okay, but the Department of Finance does have a projection for losses of the bank going forward, does it not?
We do.
Okay. That projection was not shared in the budget. I'll note that the Bank of Canada losses were consolidated with the government's Canada Mortgage Bond Program. I'll ask the bank. That wasn't your choice that wasn't the bank's choice to consolidate that line item in the budget, correct? You weren't consulted on that?
Not that we're aware.
Okay. So for the finance department, like negative $3 billion is a relatively material number. it would be very helpful for committee members and Parliament if we knew what the government projects these bank losses to be in the future. Is that something you could provide the committee?
It is. For the presentational purposes in the budget, as you say, we aggregate with other Crown corporations, but we're able to follow up in writing.
Okay, thank you very much. That would be very helpful. Now, part of the other reason there's losses is because the bank purchased government bonds, right? So this is a direct result of the quantitative easing activities that the bank undertook, correct, during COVID?
Correct.
Okay. Definitely look forward to the projections of the losses. If I may, I'll just switch gears a little bit and talk about M2 money supply. I saw a chart that's showing the Bank of Canada's balance sheet shrinking over time, which makes sense, right? Quantitative tightening. But I also have seen a chart showing M2 is actually growing. And I'm trying to understand why that's the case. If the bank is shrinking the balance sheet, how is the measure of M2 growing? Like, where's the money coming from?
So there's different definitions of the supply of money, and they measure different things. So M2 would largely grow or shrink according to demand for loans at banks. So M2, I think of M2 as the supply of money that's generated by commercial banks. So as there is an increase in demand for loans, banks can increase the supply of M2 by providing more loans. Those loans ultimately end up in savings accounts and other places around the economy. Generally, the demand for credit has been coming down, and the M2 numbers are relatively low over a historical perspective. So they are lower, but
Okay.
they would not. You wouldn't necessarily see those show up on our balance sheet.
Okay, thank you. Two quick follow-ups on that.
Yeah.
Is it possible that the government's borrowing activities, which are very substantial, not the rollover in debt per year, but the new funds required of $102 billion this year and $63 billion last year, are contributing to the growth of M2? That's a demand for credit?
Not directly, I guess
Okay.
indirectly.
So potentially indirectly. And then last question, Mr. Chair. It would be very helpful if the components of M2, is it something that you'd be able to share with the committee, the parts of M2 that are growing, that we might be able to kind of just understand, try to figure out where the money's coming from?
I think we can probably do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Now, many countries are dealing with very similar economic challenges and uncertainty in tackling the challenge of bringing inflation down. Can you perhaps speak to how Canada is faring in comparison to other G7 countries?
Sure. I mean, the country that I think many Canadians watch most closely would be the United States. I would say broadly that in the United States right now, the economy is relatively stronger compared to the Canadian economy. And inflation is a little bit, we would use the term stickier. They're having a more difficult time getting inflation down. Underlying inflation looks to be coming down a little more quickly in Canada. We need to see more data, but that's been what I would characterize as the most recent trend.
Is it a fair comparison, the U.S. economy versus the Canadian economy? I know we have significant differences in how things operate between the two. Is there a more comparable G7 nation that you think you can perhaps compare Canada to?
I think the reason that we often compare to the U.S. is because it's an economy that has a relatively big effect on our own economy. It's our largest trading partner. So I think that's really the reason that we often compare.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Rogers, you gave a speech a little while ago about productivity, and I just want to make sure I totally understand what productivity means, because I know there's a lot of jargon and term that gets thrown around here. But productivity, as I understand it, is how much Canadians produce, how much trees they turn into lumber, how much grain they grow, how many cars roll off the assembly line. It's basically the things that individual Canadians make. Is that correct?
Yeah, as a function of the inputs it takes to make them. Yeah.
And I think you also said in your speech that low productivity has a negative effect on inflation. In other words, low productivity will have the effect of having higher inflation for longer if Canada doesn't start to produce more. Is that an accurate summary of?
Not exactly. What I said in my speech is that improving productivity would help us buffer the Canadian economy against what we expect to be a potentially less benign inflationary environment going forward.
So, in terms of policy tools that would help productivity, can you think of some things that would encourage or facilitate Canadians being more productive, producing more things, and having more goods in an economy?
Sure, I talked about a couple of them in my speech. I mean, things that equip workers to be more productive in each hour they're at work, so additional training or additional tools that help workers produce more per hour. Additional investment in infrastructure, competitive environment, ensuring that we have an efficient regulatory approval process. Those are some of the examples that I used.
So would investments in capital also help with productivity?
Yes.
So would things that would be disincentives, in other words, policy tools that would punish investments in capital, I would assume would then have the opposite effect, that it would lower productivity.
You want to have an environment, all policies in that encourage investment in capital. Absolutely.
Investing in capital. Okay. You gave that speech. How long ago was it? About a month?
I think so. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Do you think it's still time to break the glass?
We haven't fixed it in the last month, if that's your question.
Well, the reason why I ask is because there was a budget tabled just recently so would you give that same speech today? Would you warn people, say that it's still an emergency situation?
I think as I said, we haven't fixed it in a month, so I think the speech stands.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the Canada mortgage bonds. I understand that the government of Canada is now purchasing, I believe it's up to $40 billion a year.
It's up to a maximum of $30 billion.
Up to a maximum of $30 billion. Okay, thanks for the correction. Do you see any impact on the money supply by the government of Canada's bond purchase program?
I don't know that if I could isolate that specific program, but Mr. Chambers asked us to give some additional data on what's affecting the money supply, and we'll be happy to do that.
Okay. And so the government of Canada will now own that mortgage debt under the bond purchase program. The Bank of Canada used to buy those bonds for a period of time. My understanding is the Bank of Canada ended that program, but you do act as the financial agent for the government of Canada to purchase these bonds. So the government of Canada will now own mortgage debt as a holding?
My understanding?
Yes, what we're doing exactly is we're basically borrowing money in order to buy finance those Canada mortgage bonds. So basically, we own some of that debt. Yeah.
So the government of Canada borrows money to buy mortgages from banks who have lent money to Canadians. Is that?
Thank you for your question. Basically, the way it works, CMHC basically borrow money in order to buy NHMBS. So those are pool of mortgages that are put together. And when you look at the market, the way it works, CMHC, when they were issuing and they're still issuing, there's a spread relative to the government of Canada debt. So when you look at the debt that the product they're issuing, they're fully backed by the government of Canada. So they should be issuing around the same rate, right? They're a AAA product. And because of that spread, the government decided to issue its own debt in order to finance the CMBs. So the debt that we are issuing, it's debt that basically CMHC doesn't have to issue on the market.
It's guaranteed by the government itself, right? So the government is both the backer of the debt and now the holder of the debt?
That debt was already guaranteed prior to the government issuing debt in order to buy CMBs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Scheer.
So, Governor Macklin confirmed that eliminating a price on pollution would lead to a one-time decrease in inflation. Is that correct?
Yes, a one-time change in a tax leads to a one-time change. So if we were to eliminate the carbon tax outright, it would have a one-time impact. That's correct.
Can you expand on what that means in terms of inflation in the long term?
Well, the impact would last 1 year. So the effect on inflation, the decrease in inflation, would disappear 1 year out. Okay, that's your question. Yeah, thanks. Okay, that's your question. Yeah, thanks.
As we look ahead and consider our future economic position, how much will benefits to the elderly increase in the medium term?
I'm not sure I understand your question, ma'am.
So has the increase in costs as a result of an aging population had an effect on your long-term economic projections?
Well, demographics are definitely one thing that affects an economy. And I mentioned earlier in response to Mr. Scheer's question that when we look ahead at the different forces in the economy, there are some forces that will have a greater or lesser degree on inflation. Demographics is definitely one. As people age, they spend more than they save, so it can be upward pressure on inflation. So yeah, demographics have an effect. I think I'm answering your question. Yeah.
I'd like to welcome the representatives from the Bank of Canada and Department of Finance, and thanks for being with us today. While it's a sunny day in Ottawa, dark clouds, storm clouds are looming across Canada as the Liberal government's inflationary spending has driven interest and mortgage rates way up. All of this borrowed money and an astronomical annual interest payment of $53 billion on a $1.3 trillion of debt. Canada is now spending more on debt interest than on health transfers. It's so sad to see more money being given to bankers and bondholders than to the provinces to pay nurses and doctors in our healthcare system, an unfortunate reality in my home province of New Brunswick. Would the Senior Deputy Governor agree Canada's inflation problem, national debt problem, and endless annual deficits under the Liberal government are closely related in damaging Canada's overall fiscal position?
I'm sorry, repeat your question, sir?
Would the Senior Deputy Governor agree Canada's inflation problem, national debt problem, and endless annual deficits under the Liberal government are closely related in damaging Canada's overall fiscal position?
I'm happy to give you the bank's view on what is causing inflation, what has caused inflation, what is still causing inflation. Inflation started in Canada as it started in many countries around the world as a result of the conditions I described earlier. We had, as a result of the pandemic, we had a number of supply chain problems. We had a global shock to the economy with the invasion of Ukraine that drove it.
With all due respect, number one, that's not the question I asked. And number two, when you print money, that also drives up inflation. So we could go there and just stay there and talk about how, even though there might have been slight inflation, the current government made inflation much higher by printing money, which drove up the cost of goods and made fewer goods. And I think that's an important point. So if you're not comfortable answering that question, I'll move on to the next one. Last week, the Governor of the Bank of Canada confirmed the Liberal government's $61 billion in new spending is not helpful in bringing inflation down and lowering interest rates. And as I've just said, the Liberal government contributed heavily to the inflation by printing money. The latest wacko spending budget brought in by Finance Minister Freeland did not stop the inflationary deficits that are driving interest rates up sky high. It will not stop endangering our social programs and jobs by adding more and more debt. Over the past 9 years, the Liberal government has doubled rent, mortgage payments, and down payments. While life has gotten worse for all Canadians, the Liberal government is spending more than ever before, including $61 billion in reckless new inflationary spending. This is costing the average Canadian family an extra $3,687 per year. Former Bank of Canada Governor David Dodge said this is the worst budget since 1982. Does the senior deputy governor agree struggling families cannot afford higher taxes and more inflationary spending that drives up the cost of everything and keeps interest rates so high?
I would agree it's been a very difficult time for Canadian households the last few years. The combination of high inflation and the response to high inflation, increase in interest rates, has been very difficult for Canadian families. Absolutely.
How much time?
1:20.
Despite a record of 9 years of failure, the Liberal government has doubled down on the same spending that has caused so much misery in the first place, pouring even more fuel on the inflationary fire and driving up interest rates. Does the senior deputy director agree that instead of giving more money to bankers and bondholders, we should be investing in our doctors and nurses?
The senior deputy governor doesn't make those decisions.
That's fair. Do you agree with it, though, the statement?
I don't make those decisions, so I don't weigh those choices. It's not my job.
So you don't have an opinion on it. Okay. Last week, the Bank of Canada governor also warned Canadians that unaffordable housing will continue into the future. This follows a recent report from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which confirmed that housing construction is plummeting as prices get more expensive. Under this current government, housing starts will be lower in 2025-26 than they were in 2020-2021. On top of this, the CMHC forecasted that rents will rise and vacancy rates will fall as more people compete for less housing. Does the senior deputy director agree that Liberal government are simply not building enough homes for Canadians to live in?
The senior deputy governor of the Bank of Canada would agree that we have a housing supply shortage in this country, and it is driving up the price of housing, one of the things that's adding to the difficulty for many households. That supply problem in housing has been with us for a long time, and it's not something that can be fixed quickly. Supply of houses is something that's going to take a long time and a concerted effort and a lot of cooperation from different levels of government to fix. And we're pleased to see that cooperation is accelerating.
Thank you very much. That is the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you, thank you to our witnesses for joining us. I'm going to begin with the Bank of Canada and hope we can get some kind of general questions out of the way off the bat. Was reviewing kind of what is currently there in terms of treasury bills and domestic marketable bonds, and my understanding is treasury bills about $276 billion outstanding, and about a little over $1 trillion in terms of bonds. Am I right to assume that as these mature, they are reallocated and re-put out for purchase at whatever the rate would be at the current time? Am I right in assuming that?
I'm going to start by asking Coralia to just clarify the numbers.
The numbers you're citing are on the government statements, so I will let the Department of Finance respond.
Those numbers are correct. Basically, we have around $270 billion in T-bills. The way it works, our debt will come to maturity. We issue our debt through auctions, and it's basically a primary dealer distribution. So we have a number of dates that are already set up that we announced at the beginning of the quarter. And basically, most of the debt that we're showing is debt that's rolling over, that we call. So I think this year we have 85% of the overall envelope that will be debt that will be rolling over that will need to be reissued in the market.
And when it's reissued in the market, if it's at a higher rate than it was prior to maturity, that increases our costs.
Of course, like it will be issued at market rate. So depending on where the rate is, and that will that will impact the interest, the debt charges that we'll have on that debt.
And so, that's exactly it. So as it matures, if it stays high, it costs Canadians more money. I want to look at the analysis, though, of the bonds. Would you be able to tell us, or is there? Could you provide the committee with a breakdown of who owns those bonds, whether it's domestic ownership or international ownership?
Yes, I can. So basically, in Canada, most of our debt, first of all, it's all issued in Canadian dollar. Most of the debt is owned by Canadian. We have 30% of our debt that's owned by foreigners. When we compare this share to other countries, other G7 countries, we're in the low range, which is really positive for Canada. Otherwise, we have around 25% that's currently owned by the Bank of Canada. The rest of it will be owned by institutional investors through basically savings that individual Canadian will put in banks and basically be funneled through the basically instrument that will include GOCs, Government of Canada debt.
Looking at the international number, about 30%, give or take, how much of that is owned by foreign states, and how much is that owned by foreign individuals or foreign entities?
That's a good question. I don't have the exact number, but for sure, what we know is that our debt, a lot of it is being owned by foreign bank, because that's part of a portfolio that's highly recognized around the world, where banks will buy a set of a number of different commodities, including Canadian dollar, and basically in order to meet that target, they will buy GOCs. So most of our debt that's owned on the foreign side is owned by central banks.
Would you be able to give us a not today, but provide the committee with a breakdown of that, which entities own that foreign debt?
We could try, but one thing that you should be aware is once we issue our debt through the primary market, it's distributed in the secondary market. So we don't know exactly who owns our debt. There's data that are available through Statistics Canada. That's what I've been able to provide you. So I can validate if there's more information available, but I don't think we'll be able to provide a disaggregated number on this.
I appreciate that. Anything you can provide, that'd be useful for my own personal interests. In the short time I may have left, I want to go back to the GDP per capita, and perhaps we'll go with Ms. Rogers with this one. Could you compare our decline in GDP per capita with our peer countries, thinking mainly about the United States, where we've seen them increase in per capita GDP growth compared to Canada? Could you comment on that?
I don't have exact numbers in front of me, or if you're asking me to give you exact data. Or?
Not exact data, just how we compare to our friends south of the border.
Well, I think you characterized it accurately, but quite honestly, I don't have a GDP per capita in the U.S. and GDP per capita in Canada, so it's difficult for me to give you a comparison. I can come.
That is your time, Mr. Nader. Thank you.
Because there does seem to be some confusion in what we hear in the House of Commons and so on between monetary policy, fiscal policy, economic policy, social policy, and so forth. And what is your mandate and the Bank of Canada, and what is the Bank of Canada responsible for?
The Bank of Canada's mandate is to steer the Canadian economy in the long-term best interest of Canadians by keeping inflation low and stable. So we're responsible for monetary policy.
Does the Government of Canada have anything to do then with monetary policy? The executive, I'm saying, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, any of those roles have anything
well,
to
certainly
do
there's
with?
a number of accountability mechanisms that are in place. I would say the most important of which, or the cornerstone, would be what we call our inflation target renewal agreement, which is an agreement that sets the bank's objectives, including the target rate of inflation. It also outlines sort of the broad policy toolkit available to the bank. That is an agreement that is renewed once every 5 years, following a broad round of consultation with the Canadian public. So that that process will be getting underway soon because the next renewal date for the agreement is in 2026. So we consider that to be sort of our cornerstone mandate document, the agreement that we have with the government on what our objectives are. Beyond that, there's a sort of a whole series of what I would call accountability mechanisms that support the independence of the Bank of Canada. We have an independent board of directors. We are audited annually by 2 separate audit firms. The Minister of Finance can, at any time, request an expansion of the scope of those audits or order a special audit. The Governor and I appear regularly before your colleagues at the House Finance Committee, also at the Senate Bank and Finance Committee, and of course here today. At every rate decision, the Governor and I hold a press conference and a press availability. We've also recently started publishing a summary of our deliberations that underpin each of our rate decisions. We annually publish an assessment of financial stability and hold a press availability. We'll be doing that for this year on Thursday of this week. And we publish an annual report. So I don't think, have I forgotten anything, Coralie? I think that's sort of the long list of what I would call accountability mechanisms in place to support our mandate and our independence.
As chair, I'm often given the right for a few questions. I've got a couple here, so I'm going to take the time here and just looking for some kind of quick responses. First of all, Ms. Shanahan, thank you for raising it because the Bank of Canada was brought in here today to talk about the losses that you're incurring now, where previously you'd always been a net contributor. You have turned into a net debtor now. Could we get a copy of you had mentioned it at a previous question and then referenced it. Could we get the time you expect to go from deficit into surplus? And then even beyond that, if you see a net to come out ahead, we would appreciate that. Is that something we can get? Good.
Yes, for sure.
Deputy Governor Rogers, it's your position, the bank's position, that the Government of Canada's deficit spending is not inflationary. Is that correct?
What we said at testimony last week is that the budget, our initial look at the most recent federal budget is that we don't expect it to contribute materially to inflation, but that the budget came out between forecasts. And as part of the next forecast, we will incorporate the budget.
Okay. Now, did the governor himself make reference that provincial deficit spending could be harmful to the inflationary outlook and could cause inflation? I read something about that. Could you clarify that, please?
Well, I think what the governor said is something he said many times before, is that when we do our forecast and when we look at inflation, we take all forms of government spending in. We don't distinguish between one government and another. We take it all in, and we measure its impact on inflation. And so whether there's regardless of the source of the spending, if the spending is outpacing growth.
So let me ask you, what's the bank's view then currently of the amount of debt we're seeing spent at the provincial level and what impact that's having on inflation?
Well, there's different provincial governments have made different decisions. Again, I would repeat what the governor has said. The economy, if governments are spending at a pace in excess of the growth rate of the economy, that is naturally going to be inflationary no matter what government is making that spending.
Thank you. You and Mr. Scheer were in a discussion about productivity gains. You had your statement on a more productive economy would be beneficial in I don't know the terms you use, sticky inflation or a less conducive inflation environment. That's basically what you said. Is that in response to
Yeah, basically I said when we look ahead, somebody asked me earlier about demographic shifts, and I've also talked a little bit today about climate.
I want to talk about productivity.
I'm getting there. Climate effects. There's a number of things going forward that we expect will make it a less benign inflationary environment. It'll be more upward pressure on inflation. Sure. A really good way to buffer the Canadian economy in that environment going forward would be to improve our productivity.
Okay. And you were saying anything that kind of impacts capital flows would have a negative impact and therefore contribute to in inflation possibly. Is that right?
Well, what I said was that one of the things that would boost our productivity is to increased investment, and so creating a climate to encourage investment would be.
So Mr. Scheer didn't go where I thought he would, which is then what's the bank's view of the capital gains tax increase, which of course is the tax which most impacts capital flows in and out of a country, and the capital gains tax inclusion rate, of course, is going to go from 50% to 2/3, and we see all kinds of warnings. What's the bank's view on that?
Thanks for your question, Mr. Chair. We are not tax experts. We do not take a view on any one tax measure. The government has a number of decisions to make to balance their budget, to create the right conditions for the economy.
Okay, look, that you're the Bank of Canada. You had a lot to say previously about the impact of climate policy. You're telling me the bank does not have a position on a capital gains tax increase that
Point of order,
investors
Chair.
are worried. Yes, Mr. Desjardins.
I believe that your latitude as our chair in this regard has stepped into overreach. And I believe that the questions that you're now pursuing are largely in favor of the Conservative Party.
Well, I can take the side. I don't believe that. I think I'm asking some pretty nonpartisan questions that I'm hearing across the country, Mr. Desjardins. I have about 45 seconds. I'd ask your leave to continue. I'm going to actually maybe check with the clerk here. So just 1 second. Why don't I finish my my last bit of time then on the side, Mr. Desjardins, and I'll let Ms. Yip take the chair. Would that satisfy you?
I'm happy for you to finish your questioning,
Okay.
just as long as we know the
All right.
parameters.
Thank you.
Of the question.
No, I think it's a fair question. One leads to an example. I hope the deputy governor can maybe give us any insight she might have, or the bank might have on a tax. On a tax that impacts capital flows, which she said would be a problem.
But do we all get this equal amount of time? Will I have another question to ask about?
Sorry, Mr.
why
Jay.
I'm not- why-
I've taken the conservative spot. No, I'm sorry. I thought I said at the top. I've taken the conservative
I
pot.
understand.
Yeah. Pardon me.
No, I
I'm not.
apologize, Chair.
This is not. Yeah.
I thought
You
this
know.
was
I was sorry.
Stepping into our other time.
No.
I understand.
No. Okay.
Please carry on.
Yeah. Thank you. You have the floor.
I would repeat my previous answer. The Bank of Canada, we are not tax experts. It's
Okay,
also
then let me just stop you then, because you mentioned something else which is really interesting. You said that at the height of the crisis, 2020, 2021, when the government was looking at providing benefits to individuals, you said something like, the bank took the position that we did not think it was worth hitting Canadians with a credit crunch. It sounds like you put aside also monetary policy as well and made a policy decision. Instead of looking at the fundamentals, you made a decision to let interest, to not worry about inflation. So my question, I suppose my last question for you is, does the Bank of Canada have any responsibility for the inflation and affordability crisis that we find ourselves in today, given that you misjudged the inflationary cycle we were in, you waited to raise interest rates, and then when you finally hit them, instead of tapping the brakes, you had to slam them on? What's the bank's role in today's affordability crisis and interest rate environment we're in that is also hurting home ownership?
I think what I said, Mr. Chair, was that in June of 2020, when we were making a decision to take extraordinary monetary policy actions.
So I don't want you to repeat I want you to answer my question about the bank's role in today's affordability crisis. That's what I want you to answer. You've mentioned the Ukraine war. You've mentioned all sorts of other variables. You have not addressed the bank's role in today's environment. And what is it? Does the bank take any ownership of today's environment? And that's my last question. I look for your answer.
I think the best way for me to answer your question, Mr. Chair, is to say something that the Governor and I have both said publicly before, which is we didn't get everything perfect. We didn't make every decision perfectly. We did not have perfect foresight. We were dealing with the same high level of uncertainty that all Canadians were facing at the time. We took the best judgments in the interest of Canadians that we could with the amount of information that we had at the time. We did our job, which is to implement the policy that we judged to be the best to guide the Canadian economy in the long term.